The high-pitched whine sliced through the ambient noise of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport's bustling Terminal B. Cooper, a 5-year-old Belgian Malinois with the ATF's K9 unit, suddenly lunged forward with such intensity that his handler, Special Agent Ryan Mercer, nearly lost his grip on the leash. "Cooper, steady!" Ryan commanded. But the disciplined explosive detection dog, who had never once faltered during his 3 years of service, was now unrecognizable. Ears pinned back, body tense, pulling with single-minded determination toward a weathered olive green duffel bag moving along the carousel. Passengers scattered instinctively, creating a widening circle of space around the agitated animal. Airport security personnel converged quickly, hands hovering near their holsters. But Ryan knew better. In all their years together, Cooper had never given a false alert. The intensity in the dog's rigid posture, the unusual vocalization emanating from his throat, this wasn't aggression. This was detection in its purest form. "Everyone back!" Ryan shouted, scanning the crowded baggage claim area. His trained eye caught it immediately. A tall man in a dark blue windbreaker, standing too still, face drained of color, eyes fixed not on the commotion, but on the olive-green duffel that Cooper refused to leave alone. When their eyes met across the terminal, Ryan saw the momentary flash of panic before the man took one decisive step backward. The duffel completed another rotation on the carousel, and Cooper's whining became more urgent, almost pleading. Whatever was inside that worn piece of luggage had triggered something primal in the veteran detection dog, and as security personnel carefully removed it from the carousel, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that Cooper hadn't just found explosives. His partner was telling him they'd stumbled upon something far more significant. Special Agent Ryan Mercer had never envisioned becoming an ATF K9 handler. At 38, the lines etched into his face told stories of 14 years in federal law enforcement. And before that, 3 tours in Afghanistan with the Army's 10th Mountain Division. The barely noticeable limp in his right leg, a souvenir from an IED outside Kandahar, became pronounced only when he was exhausted or when the Georgia humidity pressed heavy against his old wounds. The black band on his wrist, embossed with the name of Staff Sergeant Michael Landry, remained his only personal adornment, a daily reminder of the battle buddy who didn't make it home. Colleagues described Ryan as meticulous, focused, a federal agent who carried each case like a sacred responsibility. His supervisors recognized his exceptional abilities, but worried about his tendency to work himself to exhaustion, especially when cases involved veterans. Ryan had transitioned directly from military service to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, his battlefield experience with explosive devices making him a natural fit for the agency's counter-terrorism unit. His military precision was evident in everything from his case notes to his apartment, minimal, functional, organized with almost mathematical precision. But beneath the disciplined exterior lived a man driven by an unyielding commitment to protecting others from the horrors he'd witnessed firsthand. Cooper hadn't been bred for law enforcement work. The Belgian Malinois was barely a year old when Ryan found him during a raid on an illegal weapons dealer, locked in a filthy shed, underfed but still alert, and watching Ryan's every move with intelligent eyes. Against protocol, Ryan had rehabilitated Cooper himself, recognizing something remarkable in the dog's resilience and temperament. After intensive specialized training, Cooper had developed an exceptional talent for detecting the chemical signatures of explosives, earning him the nickname The Ghost among the K9 units for his ability to find trace amounts that other dogs missed. While standard detection dogs required regular reinforcement, Cooper seemed to possess an almost supernatural focus that never wavered until today. The bond between man and dog transcended the typical handler relationship. They communicated through subtle cues invisible to others, anticipated each other's movements, trusted each other's instincts implicitly. Cooper was more than Ryan's partner. He was the one being who had witnessed Ryan's rare moments of vulnerability when nightmares of Afghanistan occasionally broke through his carefully maintained composure. The investigation would bring them into the orbits of people whose lives would become irrevocably intertwined with their own. Dr. Eliza Chen, the VA hospital's chief of psychiatric services, whose groundbreaking work with veterans suffering from PTSD had attracted both acclaim and controversy. Deputy Director Thomas Blackwell, the politically connected agency administrator, pushing for quick case closures to maintain the ATF's funding levels, constantly pressuring Ryan to follow procedure rather than instinct. Marcus Wilson, the nervous airport janitor who had served in the same region of Afghanistan as Ryan, and whose trembling hands and haunted eyes suggested a man carrying burdens beyond his civilian job description. And looming in the background was Senator Nathan Chambers, chairman of the Defense Appropriations Committee, whose public advocacy for veterans' causes couldn't quite mask the whispers about misallocated funds. Allegations that never quite stuck. The secure examination room in the airport's security wing grew more tense with each passing minute. Marcus Wilson sat rigidly in the metal chair, his fingers drumming an irregular pattern on the table surface. Ryan observed him through the one-way glass before entering, noting the man's military bearing that persisted despite his civilian clothes, and the janitor uniform folded neatly beside him. Wilson flinched when Ryan placed a photograph of the open duffel bag on the table, revealing rows of prescription medication bottles with VA pharmacy labels. "I don't know anything about what's inside," Wilson insisted, his voice faltering. "I was just asked to watch for it and make sure it got picked up." Ryan remained silent, allowing the discomfort to expand until Wilson continued unprompted. "A guy approached me in the VA waiting room last month, said he knew I worked airport maintenance, offered me $5,000 to just make sure a bag made it through, said it contained medications for vets who couldn't get them through proper channels." When Ryan showed him a photograph of Derek Sullivan, a former Army medic discharged under questionable circumstances, Wilson's eyes widened in recognition. "That's him, the guy who approached me, but something seemed off about him. He kept checking his phone like he was being monitored or something." What Wilson revealed next sent a chill through the room. Since agreeing to help, he'd been experiencing intensifying symptoms of his PTSD, flashbacks during daylight hours, voices of his fallen comrades seeming to warn him about something he couldn't understand. "I thought it was just stress," Wilson whispered, gesturing toward the photograph, unable to finish his sentence. As Ryan pressed further, Wilson's demeanor shifted from nervous to defeated. "I know how this looks, Agent Mercer, but I swear, if I'd known, I just wanted to help other vets. You know how the system fails us." The look in Wilson's eyes, the desperate need to believe he'd been helping rather than harming his fellow veterans, was painfully familiar to Ryan. Dr. Eliza Chen worked methodically in the laboratory, her gloved hands carefully documenting each prescription bottle before testing its contents. Oxycodone tablets labeled 5 mg, but chemical analysis shows fentanyl mixed with counterfeit binding agents. She dictated into the recorder suspended above the examination table. Potentially lethal doses if taken as directed on the labels. Her assistant photographed the falsified VA prescription labels, the patient names and doctor signatures appearing authentic at first glance, but revealing subtle inconsistencies under magnification. Ryan stood silently observing until Eliza acknowledged his presence with a grim nod. "I've prioritized the toxicology analysis, but I'm already seeing patterns consistent with the Louisville VA pharmacy thefts." 2 months earlier, a shipment of controlled substances had disappeared from a Veterans Affairs pharmacy in Kentucky. The medications were logged as properly dispensed to patients, but subsequent investigation revealed dozens of veterans who'd been told their prescriptions were delayed or unavailable. "The timing aligns," Ryan muttered, spreading out case files on the adjacent table, "and the medication types match exactly." His phone vibrated. Deputy Director Blackwell demanding updates. Ryan texted back a brief status report before returning. To Eliza, "Casualty projections?" She frowned, examining a tablet under the microscope. "Based on these dosage levels, we'd be looking at potentially hundreds of overdoses, primarily veterans already being treated for chronic pain or PTSD. Their bodies would likely have existing tolerances to opioids, but not at these concentrations." Ryan's attention shifted to the military identification cards found hidden in a secret compartment of the duffel, now sealed in evidence bags. "And these?" Eliza's expression darkened. "Sophisticated forgeries, but the magnetic strips contain actual patient data. Someone has access to the VA's prescription database." As Ryan prepared to leave, Eliza called after him. "Ryan, the forgery patterns on these prescriptions, they match 3 other cases in our system from military hospitals across different states." A cold certainty settled in Ryan's gut. This wasn't an isolated case of drug trafficking. This was systematic exploitation of veterans on a scale he'd never encountered. Ryan returned to his apartment well after midnight, Cooper padding quietly beside him. The dog's routine was unwavering, a careful inspection of each room before settling on his bed in the corner of Ryan's bedroom. But tonight, Cooper remained vigilant, sensing his handler's distress. Ryan spread the case files across his kitchen, in table, pinning photos and timelines to a corkboard he'd installed when first assigned to the investigation. Derek Sullivan's military ID photo looked out from his service record. Cropped hair, steady gaze, the confident expression of a combat medic who'd saved countless lives before his dishonorable discharge for prescription drug theft. The inconsistencies were mounting. Sullivan's discharge had been pushed through with unusual speed, the testimony against him coming from a commanding officer who had since been promoted to a Pentagon position. Medical records showed Sullivan had attempted to file complaints about irregularities in medication dispensing just weeks before the accusations against him surfaced. Ryan's phone rang. Deputy Director Blackwell again. "Mercer, I'm reassigning the case to Williams." Ryan's grip tightened on the receiver. "Sir, with respect, we're making significant progress." "This isn't a request, Mercer. You're too close to this one. Your history with veterans issues is precisely why I should lead the investigation." The ensuing silence stretched uncomfortably before Blackwell sighed. "You have 72 hours to show actionable results before I make the transfer official." Ryan hung up, turning back to the board where he'd just added a new element, a newspaper clipping about Senator Chambers' private security firm, which had recently won a no-bid contract to provide services at multiple VA facilities across the Southeast. Witness statements from hospital staff mentioned increased restrictions on pharmacy access, coinciding with the new security presence, though no direct connection to the missing medications had been established. Ryan stepped back, the larger pattern emerging before him: the Louisville thefts, Sullivan's suspicious discharge, the counterfeit medications, the sophisticated forgeries. How many veterans had already been harmed? Cooper whined softly, nudging Ryan's hand as if sensing the weight of responsibility settling on his handler's shoulders. "I know, boy," Ryan whispered, scratching behind the dog's ears. "We'll figure this out." But a voice in the back of his mind, a voice that had haunted him since losing Landry in Afghanistan, whispered back, "You're running out of time. And even if you solve this, how many more veterans will be exploited before it's over?" The break-in was professional and nearly undetectable. No broken windows, no forced locks, no obvious disturbance to Ryan's apartment. He might not have noticed at all if not for Cooper's behavior. The normally disciplined dog raced from room to room upon their return from a follow-up interview, nose to the ground, ears alert, inspecting every corner and doorway. Ryan drew his service weapon, following Cooper's lead through the familiar space that suddenly felt violated. Nothing appeared to be missing. His laptop remained untouched on the desk, case files undisturbed on the kitchen table, but taped to his bathroom mirror was a VA prescription label he hadn't seen before, with the words, "Some medications are better left undispensed," written across it in precise block letters. Ryan carefully preserved the note as evidence, then began a methodical sweep for surveillance devices or cameras. He found nothing, which somehow felt more unsettling than confirmation of monitoring. An hour later, as he sat reviewing airport security footage, Cooper's behavior changed again. The dog positioned himself protectively between Ryan and the apartment door, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Ryan muted the television, listening intently. Footsteps in the hallway paused outside his door, followed by the soft sound of paper sliding underneath. Drawing his weapon again, Ryan approached cautiously. A plain manila envelope lay on the floor, his name typed on the front. Inside was a photograph of Ryan leaving the ATF field office earlier that day and a handwritten note, "Prescription for Agent Mercer. Drop the investigation. Some wounds can't be healed." Ryan stared at the photograph, noting the high angle and distance that suggested professional surveillance equipment. His phone rang, Deputy Director Blackwell's name flashing on the screen. Ryan silenced it, turning instead to the window where he observed a dark sedan with tinted windows idling across the street. When he blinked, it was gone. Whether real or imagined, the message was clear. Someone wanted him off this case, which only strengthened his resolve to pursue it. Cooper remained alert at his side, sensing danger that couldn't be seen, but was palpable in the stillness of the apartment. In that moment, Ryan knew with certainty that he had stumbled into something far larger and more dangerous than counterfeit medications. Like the IEDs he'd learned to detect in Afghanistan, he was seeing only the exposed trigger of something much more deadly beneath the surface. The forensic laboratory was silent, except for the rhythmic hum of equipment and the occasional clicking of computer keys as Ryan reviewed Derek Sullivan's military service record. Dr. Chen had prioritized the database search at his request, her findings confirming his suspicions. Sullivan's discharge paperwork contained inconsistencies, dates that didn't align, signatures from officers who weren't stationed at the base during the alleged incidents, and most tellingly, different versions of the same documents filed in separate systems. Someone altered the records after the fact, Eliza explained, highlighting relevant discrepancies on her monitor. The original complaint Sullivan filed about medication discrepancies disappeared from the official system, but fragments remain in the backup archive. Based on the digital timestamps, I'd estimate the records were modified approximately 48 hours after he was accused of theft. Ryan studied the evidence with fresh eyes. The hasty discharge, the missing complaints, the subsequent pattern of pharmacy, thefts at facilities where Sullivan had attempted to report problems. This wasn't a disgruntled medic stealing drugs. This was a whistleblower being silenced. Sullivan was trying to expose the operation, Ryan concluded, not participate in it. Eliza nodded, pulling up additional files on her secure terminal. I took the liberty of checking medical examiner records with similar patterns over the past 3 years. 7 veterans have died from apparent overdoses involving medications that were supposedly secured in VA pharmacies. All had filled prescriptions. Within days of shipments going missing, as they compared timelines, a pattern emerged. Each pharmacy theft had been preceded by security protocol changes implemented by Centurion Group, Senator Chambers' private security firm. Ryan assembled a map marking the locations, the invisible threads between them becoming increasingly clear. When his phone rang, Deputy Director Blackwell's irritation was palpable even through the brief text message, "My office, now." Ryan ignored it, focusing instead on Sullivan's last known movements. In the week before going underground, Sullivan had made multiple calls to a burner phone purchased with cash at a convenience store near Fort Benning. Security footage showed Sullivan appearing, agitated, repeatedly checking over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. "He knew something," Ryan murmured. "Whatever it was, got him pushed out and forced into hiding." As Eliza continued cross-referencing data, Ryan received an email that made his blood run cold. The fingerprints lifted from one of the falsified prescriptions matched a set in the military database, not Sullivan's, but those of a Sergeant James Reeves, killed in action in Afghanistan 6 years earlier. In that moment, the investigation transformed from drug trafficking into something potentially more sinister. Someone was using the identities of fallen soldiers to facilitate a massive counterfeit drug operation, targeting the very veterans who had served alongside them. Senator Nathan Chambers' charity foundation occupied the top floor of a gleaming office tower overlooking the Atlanta skyline. From the reception area, Ryan could see the senator's campaign slogan emblazoned across promotional materials, "Standing strong for those who served." Senator Chambers is currently unavailable, his executive assistant repeated for the third time, her professional smile never wavering. "He's attending a veterans fundraiser in Washington and won't return until next week." Ryan left his card anyway, knowing Chambers would never call back. At the field office, he assembled a small, trusted team to dig deeper into Chambers' background, assigning agents to investigate his financial records, political connections, and business interests. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Over an 8-year period, Chambers had championed legislation that privatized various aspects of veteran healthcare, each bill creating new opportunities for private contractors, many of which had made substantial contributions to his campaigns. 5 former VA administrators had attempted to raise concerns about pharmaceutical inventory discrepancies after Centurion Group took over security. All were either transferred, encouraged to retire, or found themselves facing unrelated misconduct. Allegations. Most concerning were the geographical connections. Chambers' fundraising schedule overlapped with the timing of pharmacy thefts in 4 different states. His security firm had implemented new protocols at each facility just days before medications disappeared, supposedly to enhance protection of controlled substances. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, there was nothing concrete enough for an arrest warrant or even a formal investigation into the senator. Chambers' team of political allies and legal advisors had constructed an impenetrable shield around him, designed to deflect precisely these types of allegations. Ryan's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Karen Sullivan, Derek's ex-wife, now working as a physician's assistant at a rural clinic after being forced to relocate following her husband's discharge. Initially reluctant to speak with federal agents, she finally agreed to meet Ryan at a diner outside Atlanta. Derek wasn't stealing drugs, she said immediately, voice lowered despite the empty restaurant where they met. He was documenting discrepancies in the inventory systems, medications logged as dispensed to patients who never received them, controlled substances disappearing between the supply room and the pharmacy. She described how Sullivan had attempted to follow proper channels, reporting the issues to his commanding officer, then to the base medical director, and finally preparing documentation for the Inspector General. The night before he was going to submit the final report, our home was broken into. Nothing was taken except his laptop and files. 2 days later, he was being escorted off base, accused of the very thing he was trying to expose. Karen pulled a flash drive from her purse, sliding it across the table. Derek mailed this to me last month. No return address, no note, just this. The drive contained encrypted backup files of Sullivan's original documentation. Photographs of inventory logs, discrepancy reports, screenshots of database entries before they were altered, and most significantly, a list of names. Veterans who had received counterfeit medications and subsequently reported adverse effects that were dismissed as expected side effects or anxiety reactions. The last time Derek called, Karen continued, her voice breaking slightly, he said someone high up was involved, someone with enough influence to make a decorated combat medic look like a common thief. He said he was close to proving it, but needed to stay underground until he had irrefutable evidence. As Ryan compiled the evidence for a search warrant for Centurion Group's headquarters, notification came through that Senator Chambers had abruptly left Washington, his private jet, filing a new flight plan to his ranch in Wyoming. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Somehow, Chambers had been tipped off about the investigation. He felt impossibly tense as Ryan faced his former commanding officer, Colonel David Richards, now serving as military liaison to the Senate Defense Committee. Their shared history in Afghanistan, where Richards had been the officer who pulled Ryan to safety after the IED explosion that killed Landry, made the current confrontation even more difficult. "You're targeting a sitting senator based on circumstantial evidence," Richards stated flatly, not a question but an accusation. The small conference room at the federal building felt impossibly tense as Ryan faced his former commanding officer, Colonel David Richards, now serving as military liaison to the Senate Defense Committee. Their shared history in Afghanistan, where Richards had been the officer who pulled Ryan to safety after the IED explosion that killed Landry, made the current confrontation even more difficult. "You're targeting a sitting senator based on circumstantial evidence," Richards stated flatly. Not a question, but an accusation. Ryan slid a file across the table. "This isn't about politics, sir. This is about veterans being exploited, potentially dying from counterfeit medications connected to Chambers' security operation." Richards didn't touch the file, maintaining the rigid posture that had earned him the nickname Steel Spine among his troops. "If you have evidence, follow proper channels. Otherwise, you're risking your career on a conspiracy theory." Ryan leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Do you remember what you told us after we lost Landry? That if we ever had to choose between following orders and doing what's right, you'd expect us to remember why we wore the uniform in the first place." Richard stood abruptly, straightening his perfectly pressed uniform. "That's not fair, Mercer. None of this is fair. These veterans served their country, and now they're being poisoned for profit." The silence stretched between them, years of shared battlefield history crashing against the immovable object of political reality. Finally, Richards gathered his briefcase. "I have to go. I'm due at the Pentagon." At the door, he paused without turning around. "Check the Medicare billing records against the VA dispensation logs. That's all I can say." He left Ryan sitting, alone, contemplating both the fractured bond of military brotherhood and the unexpected lead. The investigation took another unexpected turn that evening when Ryan received a call from Marcus Wilson's wife. Wilson had disappeared after being released from questioning, leaving behind a handwritten letter claiming sole responsibility for the counterfeit medication operation. Ryan rushed to the Wilson home, finding Mrs. Wilson clutching the letter with trembling hands. "This isn't Marcus," she insisted, showing Ryan the paper. "He'd never write something like this. And look at the handwriting. It's close, but it's not his." The forged confession made no sense. Details were wrong, timeline impossible, motivation inconsistent with Wilson's character and financial situation. When Ryan called Wilson's cell phone, it went straight to voicemail, but a location ping placed the phone near a storage facility on the outskirts of Atlanta. Ryan and a tactical team converged on the location, finding Wilson's car abandoned in the parking lot. Following Cooper's lead, they traced Wilson's scent to a specific storage unit. When the door was opened, they found not Wilson, but a makeshift laboratory containing pill presses, binding agents, pharmaceutical dyes, and printing equipment for creating fake prescription labels. And pinned to the wall was a map identifying VA facilities across the southeast, with red markers indicating locations where thefts had already occurred and yellow markers showing apparent future targets. The operation was far larger than Ryan had initially believed, suggesting an organized network rather than a small group of opportunistic criminals. Forensic analysis of the equipment yielded multiple fingerprints, none matching Wilson or Sullivan, but several corresponding to former military personnel now employed by Centurion Group. Most significantly, a laptop found hidden behind a false wall contained emails between a Centurion executive and offshore accounts, discussing merchandise distribution and inventory acquisition in language clearly designed to obscure the true nature of the transactions, while the evidence strengthened the case against Chambers' security company. Wilson remained missing. His disappearance added urgency to an already time-sensitive investigation, not just to find him, potentially alive, but to prevent the next phase of the operation indicated on the map. 48 hours after discovering the storage unit, another development. A security camera at a highway rest stop captured footage of Wilson being forced into a black SUV by two men in tactical gear. The vehicle's license plate was registered to a shell company that, after several layers of corporate veils were penetrated, connected back to Centurion Group. "They're tying up loose ends," Ryan told his team during an emergency briefing, "which means they know we're getting close." The coordinated search for Wilson expanded across 3 states, involving multiple agencies and a dedicated forensic team monitoring all communications associated with Centurion Group. Meanwhile, Ryan focused on the Medicare billing records Richards had mentioned, discovering a complex scheme where the stolen medications were being billed to both the VA and Medicare, effectively doubling the government payout while veterans received dangerous counterfeits. The scheme's sophistication indicated professional financial expertise beyond what security contractors would typically possess. Following the money trail revealed an offshore consulting firm that provided services exclusively to one client, a political action committee chaired by Senator Chambers. The international hunt for Derek Sullivan intensified as Ryan coordinated, with military contacts in countries where the former medic might have sought refuge. Sullivan's combat experience and medical training made him exceptionally resourceful, capable of staying off the grid while gathering evidence against those who had destroyed his career. ATF intelligence analysts tracked financial transactions through a series of anonymous cryptocurrency transfers that suggested Sullivan was moving methodically through Southeast Asia, always one step ahead of those pursuing him. "He's not running scared," Ryan explained to Dr. Chen as they reviewed Sullivan's movement patterns on a digital map. "This is calculated, planned. He's gathering something." Reports from contacts in Thailand confirmed Sullivan had stayed briefly at a small medical clinic near Chiang Mai, treating local patients while using a false identity before vanishing again when men claiming to be Interpol agents began asking questions in nearby villages. His training as a combat medic allowed him to support himself while maintaining a low profile in regions where medical care was scarce and few questions were asked about credentials. Financial crime specialists uncovered a complex network of transactions, linking offshore accounts that had been activated in sequence as Sullivan moved, transferring small amounts through digital currencies and remittance services that were difficult to track. The pattern suggested not panicked flight, but a methodical operation to document a criminal network's global reach. When facial recognition software identified Sullivan at a medical supply warehouse in Malaysia, he wasn't alone. Security footage showed him examining pharmaceutical packaging with a local doctor, who was later identified as a former US Army physician who had resigned his commission after filing complaints about medical supply irregularities at a military hospital in Germany. The connection suggested Sullivan was assembling allies who shared his concerns about the counterfeit medication operation. Further investigation revealed that Sullivan had been systematically connecting with former military medical personnel across Asia, each of whom had attempted to report pharmaceutical discrepancies through proper channels, only to face career-ending consequences. Together, they were building a case that spanned multiple countries and military installations. "We're not dealing with a rogue medic," Ryan told Eliza as they reviewed the expanding evidence board. "Sullivan is assembling a coalition of whistleblowers who were individually silenced but collectively hold pieces of a global operation." Ryan's small, trusted team worked from a secured conference room at the field office, walls now covered with photographs, timelines, and string connecting seemingly disparate elements of the case. "We're following a pattern," Ryan explained to the assembled agents, tracing Sullivan's movements on a large map. Each location connects to a military installation or VA facility where pharmaceutical supplies were compromised. Sullivan isn't evading capture, he's documenting a supply chain. As the team assembled the pieces, a disturbing picture emerged. Legitimate pharmaceuticals were being diverted from military and VA facilities, replaced with counterfeits manufactured in unregulated factories, with the profits funding various political operations through a labyrinth of shell companies and dark money organizations. When facial recognition software identified James Reeves, the supposedly deceased sergeant whose fingerprints had appeared on the falsified prescriptions, at a private airfield in Cambodia, the case took another shocking turn. Reeves wasn't dead. Despite his official status as killed in action, he was very much alive and apparently working security for the same operation Sullivan was trying to expose. "We need to update our search parameters," Ryan instructed the intelligence analysts. "Cross-reference all KIA reports from Sullivan's unit against any biometric scans worldwide in the past 5 years." The results were staggering. 3 additional soldiers, officially listed as killed in action, had triggered facial recognition matches at border crossings or security checkpoints around the globe. All had supposedly died in the same Taliban attack. The claimed Reeves, an incident with few survivors and limited verification of casualties in the chaos of battlefield conditions. "They didn't die," Ryan concluded, the implication sending a chill through the room. "They were recruited or coerced into disappearing, their deaths providing perfect cover for new identities untethered from their past." As the net tightened around the global operation, troubling reports surfaced of witnesses suddenly recanting statements or disappearing. Someone with considerable resources was actively obstructing the investigation, reaching across borders to eliminate threats. Sullivan's carefully coordinated movements suggested not only extensive planning, but also inside knowledge of how he was being tracked. Someone was feeding him information about the investigation while simultaneously trying to shut it down. Ryan ordered communications blackout for the task force, limiting case details to in-person briefings only. 3 days later, Interpol agents raided a pharmaceutical warehouse in Singapore, missing Sullivan by mere hours, but seizing computers and documents that proved to be the first concrete evidence linking the counterfeit drug operation directly to Centurion Group and, by extension, to Senator Chambers. Cooper's behavior changed dramatically as they approached the abandoned rural clinic property. The Belgian Malinois, typically disciplined and methodical during searches, became intensely focused, pulling Ryan toward a detached storage building rather than the main facility where the rest of the search team was concentrating their efforts. Ryan had learned to trust his partner's instincts, radioing for backup as he followed the dog's lead. The property had emerged as a location of interest after financial records showed it had been purchased through a shell company connected to Centurion Group 3 years earlier, despite having no apparent connection to their security operations. The storage building appeared unremarkable, its white paint peeling, windows boarded over, but Cooper circled the concrete floor with growing intensity, scratching at a specific section near the back wall. "We need ground-penetrating radar here," Ryan called to the forensic team, marking the area with spray paint. While technicians set up their equipment, he examined the structure itself, noting newer hinges on an otherwise weathered door leading to a basement. The door was secured with a high-security electronic lock, incongruous with the dilapidated building surrounding it. When the lock was bypassed and the door swung open, the beam of Ryan's flashlight revealed steep stairs descending into darkness. The air rushing up from below carried a distinctive medicinal smell that caused Cooper to sneeze repeatedly. Ryan led the tactical team down the narrow staircase into an underground chamber that extended far beyond what the building's exterior dimensions suggested. Motion-activated lights flickered on automatically as they entered, revealing a space that had been converted into a sophisticated counterfeit pharmaceutical operation. Against the walls stood professional-grade equipment for pill pressing, coating, and packaging. One section contained design stations for creating convincing replicas of VA prescription labels and pharmaceutical packaging. The forensic team worked methodically, photographing everything before disturbing the scene. What they discovered confirmed their worst fears. Not just an operation to steal and resell legitimate medications, but a comprehensive system for manufacturing counterfeits using industrial chemicals, binding agents, and coloring compounds that merely mimicked the appearance of proper medications while containing either no active ingredients or dangerous substitutes. "These aren't opportunistic thieves," observed the forensic chemist, examining the equipment. "This is a professional operation with significant investment and pharmaceutical knowledge. They're not just stealing medications, they're mass-producing fakes that look identical to the real thing, but could be lethal." In a refrigerated storage unit, they found thousands of counterfeit pills, sorted by type and dosage, each virtually indistinguishable from legitimate medications without chemical analysis. Most disturbing were the detailed patient databases containing information that should have been securely held in VA systems, names, dosages, prescription schedules, and treatment histories for thousands of veterans across the country. Ryan moved through the underground facility with growing horror, the scope of the operation far exceeding his initial suspicions. This wasn't merely theft and counterfeiting, but a systematic exploitation of vulnerable veterans on an industrial scale. In the final section of the facility, Cooper alerted to a locked door that required additional time to breach. Inside, they discovered not more counterfeiting equipment, but what appeared to be a detention room containing a narrow bed, restraints, and basic sanitation facilities. On the wall were photographs of Marcus Wilson and his family, along with detailed information about their daily routines, suggesting Wilson had been under surveillance long before he was approached about the airport bag. While no physical evidence of Wilson was found in the room, A calendar on the wall had dates marked with initials, the most recent showing MW 3 days earlier. Whether he had been held there and moved or something worse had occurred remained unclear, but the discovery added urgency to the search for the missing veteran. Outside in the fresh air, Ryan braced himself against the storage building wall, the weight of what they'd discovered settling like lead in his stomach. Deputy Director Blackwell approached, his earlier skepticism replaced by grim determination. "We found 2 more facilities like this one in other states," Blackwell confirmed. "This wasn't the work of a few corrupt individuals, Mercer. This was an operation with infrastructure, funding, and protection from the highest levels." The evidence collection continued through the night, each new discovery painting a more disturbing picture of the operation's scope. Most damning was a secure digital vault containing what appeared to be insurance, blackmail material on officials who had been coerced into cooperation, including medical directors, security personnel, and government inspectors who had looked the other way when inventory discrepancies were reported. Marcus Wilson's eyes never left the monitor displaying real-time surveillance of his hospital room. The operation had been Ryan's idea, using Chambers' predictable pattern of eliminating witnesses against him. Wilson had been found semi-conscious at a bus station 2 states away, apparently drugged and abandoned when his usefulness as a scapegoat was compromised by the discovery of the storage unit laboratory. Now recovering under guard, Wilson had agreed to the risk immediately, desperate to make amends for his unwitting role in the operation. "You understand what we're asking," Ryan had explained during the briefing. "We need you visible, vulnerable. If Chambers people are watching, they'll see an opportunity." Wilson had nodded, a new steadiness in his formerly trembling hands. "I understand, whatever it takes to bring them down." Now, as Wilson sat alone in the hospital room, pretending to write a statement, Ryan and his team monitored from an adjacent room. 3 hours into the operation, security cameras caught movement. A hospital staff member approaching Wilson's room with an access card, cap pulled low over his face. "That's not hospital personnel," confirmed the security supervisor after checking staff records. Ryan watched the man's movements, noting the unnatural bulge under his scrubs, armed, possibly with a suppressed weapon, given the confidence with which he approached the door in a public hospital corridor. "Move in on my signal," Ryan instructed. The tactical team positioned at both ends of the hallway as the man entered Wilson's room. Cameras captured the swift change in his demeanor, the careful closing of the door, the removal of the disguise, the withdrawn weapon. Ryan gave the signal seconds before the man reached Wilson, who was sitting with his back to the door, as instructed. The tactical team breached with precision, subduing the assailant before he could fire. In the chaos of the arrest, Ryan focused on the man's face, immediately recognizing him as James Reeves, the supposedly deceased sergeant whose fingerprints had been found on the counterfeit prescriptions and who had been spotted with Sullivan in Cambodia. The trap had worked, yielding not only an arrest, but a direct connection between the counterfeit drug operation and the falsification of military casualty records. In the interrogation room, Reeves maintained stubborn silence despite the evidence stacked against him. The weapon with his fingerprints, the surveillance footage, the forged hospital credentials. It was only when Ryan presented photographs of the underground counterfeiting facility that the first cracks appeared in his composure. "You think I knew about that?" Reeves asked, genuine revulsion crossing his features. "That wasn't part of the deal." Ryan seized on the opening, building rapport over the next several hours as Reeves gradually revealed the outlines of the operation. According to Reeves, after being seriously wounded in the Taliban attack, he had been approached in the military hospital by representatives of a private security firm offering an unusual proposition: a new identity, substantial compensation, and guaranteed medical care in exchange for his death and subsequent service to the organization. They told me I'd be providing security for pharmaceutical transports, protecting legitimate medications, Reeves explained, the bitterness evident in his voice. By the time I realized what was really happening, they had evidence of my participation. I was trapped. Reeves revealed multiple layers of the operation, how military members with specific skills were recruited at vulnerable moments, how death records were falsified with the help of corrupt officials, how legitimate medications were diverted, and counterfeits substituted in a scheme that generated millions while putting countless veterans at risk. According to Reeves, the operation maintained strict compartmentalization, with different teams handling different aspects: recruitment, acquisition, production, distribution, with no single person knowing the entire structure except those at the very top. The confirmation that Chambers likely answered to someone even more powerful sent the investigation in a new direction. The breakthrough came when Reeves, facing multiple serious charges and seeking consideration, offered information on Sullivan's emergency extraction protocol, a secure communication channel established before Sullivan went underground, designed to be used only in dire circumstances. If activated, it would guide Sullivan to a predetermined extraction point where his evidence could be securely transferred. As international authorities mobilized to implement the protocol, satellite imagery confirmed movement consistent with Reeves's information. For the first time since the investigation began, Ryan felt the balance shifting in their favor, the net tightening around a criminal enterprise that had exploited the very systems designed to care for those who had served their country. But the nagging question remained: how far up did the conspiracy reach, and how had it remained protected for so long? The digital forensics team worked around the clock to recover data from servers seized at the underground facility. On the fourth morning, their lead technician requested Ryan's immediate presence, her voice uncharacteristically tense over the phone. In a darkened room illuminated only by computer screens, she showed him what they had found: meticulously organized files dating back nearly 5 years, each containing detailed records of counterfeiting operations, diverted medications, and compromised officials. We've recovered documentation on operations affecting at least 14 different VA facilities and 8 military hospitals, she explained, opening a secured folder, including video evidence of individuals being recruited or coerced into participation. Ryan steeled himself as the technician played a video file timestamp from 18 months earlier. The footage showed Marcus Wilson in what appeared to be a hospital room, disoriented but alert, speaking to an off-camera interviewer whose voice had been digitally altered. "Please," Wilson's voice cracked through the speakers. "I just need my medication. I can't go through withdrawal again." The interviewer asked pointed questions about Wilson's financial situation, his VA disability status, the inadequacy of his benefits, and his access to secure areas of the airport, building a comprehensive profile of a vulnerable veteran who could be exploited. The technician opened another file containing employment records from the airport, showing that Wilson had been deliberately placed in his position by a staffing agency connected to Centurion Group. He hadn't been randomly approached. He had been carefully selected and positioned where he would be useful to the operation. Further, files revealed dozens of similar cases: veterans in key positions at transportation hubs, medical facilities, and security operations, each compromised through some combination of financial pressure, medical necessity, or direct coercion. The most damning evidence came from a hidden, encrypted partition containing financial records that directly linked Centurion Group's pharmaceutical operation to a network of political action committees. The money trail was deliberately complex, flowing through shell companies, offshore accounts, and seemingly legitimate businesses, but ultimately led back to campaign contributions, lobbying expenditures, and consulting fees paid to officials in positions to influence pharmaceutical regulations and government contracts. They weren't just poisoning veterans for profit, Ryan realized, scanning the documents. They were using those profits to buy political influence that protected the entire operation. The technical analyst nodded grimly, pointing to a series of transfers. These payments align perfectly with key legislative votes and regulatory decisions affecting VA pharmaceutical protocols over the past 4 years. Most disturbing was a dedicated folder containing what appeared to be compromising information on officials who had been resistant to cooperation. The files included surveillance photographs, recorded conversations, and detailed dossiers on personal vulnerabilities, ranging from financial troubles to extramarital affairs to undisclosed medical conditions. The operation had weaponized private information to ensure compliance from those who might otherwise have exposed their activities. "This is how they've stayed protected," Ryan muttered, scrolling through the files. Anyone who threatened them was either recruited, compromised, or eliminated. A separate set of files documented veterans who had experienced adverse reactions to counterfeit medications. Rather than responding with concern, the operation had systematically discredited these individuals, falsifying medical records to suggest psychological issues, addiction problems, or non-compliance with treatment protocols. In several cases, veterans who persistently reported problems were subjected to involuntary psychiatric evaluations based on fabricated symptoms. The forensic analysis of Sullivan's movements, combined with the recovered data, painted a clear picture of what the former medic had been doing during his time underground, methodically documenting identical operations in military installations across Asia and Europe, connecting with others who had attempted to expose the scheme, and assembling irrefutable evidence that the counterfeit medication operation extended far beyond American veterans to military personnel worldwide. As the investigation expanded, Ryan received an urgent call from an Interpol contact. Sullivan had initiated the emergency extraction protocol, requesting secure transport for himself and materials of international significance. The location was a remote medical clinic in the Philippines, operated by Doctors Without Borders and staffed primarily by former military medical personnel. Ryan immediately deployed with a small team, coordinating with local authorities for the sensitive extraction. After 20 hours of travel and a tense 4-hour journey by boat to the isolated coastal clinic, Ryan finally came face to face with the man he'd been tracking for weeks. Derek Sullivan had lost weight since his military ID photo was taken. His face, leaner and deeply tanned from months in tropical climates, but his eyes retained the intense focus evident in his service record, the unwavering gaze of someone who had found clarity of purpose through hardship. "You've been busy," Ryan said simply, as they sat in the clinic's small administrative office, surrounded by local security and ATF personnel. Sullivan nodded, sliding a weatherproof case across the desk. "So have you, judging by the increased security on my trail." Both sides stepped up their game in the past week. The case contained 5 encrypted hard drives organized by region, each representing countless hours of dangerous undercover work, documenting how the counterfeit drug operation extended throughout global military supply chains. "It's bigger than Chambers, bigger than Centurion," Sullivan explained, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed something previously unimaginable. "They're just the American distribution node in a multinational operation. The real money isn't even in the diverted medications. It's in what they've built with the profits." Sullivan had traced the operation to manufacturing facilities in 6 countries, all using similar methods to infiltrate legitimate pharmaceutical supply chains serving military and veteran healthcare systems. The counterfeits were designed not for maximum lethality, which would draw immediate attention, but for subtle long-term damage that mimicked treatment failure or disease progression. "They're not trying to kill patients quickly," Sullivan explained, pulling up chemical analysis reports on his laptop. "These formulations are designed to cause gradual organ damage while appearing to be legitimate medications failing to control symptoms. The veterans blame their underlying conditions worsening, not their medications being poison." The most disturbing discovery came when Sullivan cross-referenced the targeted medications with emerging political lobbying efforts. The same political action groups funded by this operation are pushing legislation to privatize more veteran healthcare services while simultaneously investing in private hospitals specializing in kidney failure, liver disease, and other conditions. These counterfeits eventually cause. They're creating both the problem and the for-profit solution. The scope of Sullivan's evidence was overwhelming. Thousands of pages of documentation, hundreds of hours of covert recordings, and computational analysis demonstrating statistical impossibilities in disease progression among veterans receiving medications from compromised facilities. He had built a case so comprehensive it could withstand any attempt at discrediting individual elements. "How did you stay ahead of them for so long?" Ryan asked, as they prepared the evidence for secure transport. Sullivan's expression darkened. "I had help from others who tried to report problems through proper channels and were shut down. We formed a network. Doctors, nurses, pharmacists, logistics specialists, all veterans who recognized what was happening to their brothers and sisters." He hesitated before continuing. "And I had someone on the inside feeding me information. Someone high enough to know how they were tracking me, but devastated by what the operation was doing to veterans." Before Ryan could press for the source's identity, security alerts sounded throughout the clinic. Surveillance had detected fast-moving boats approaching from multiple directions, unmarked vessels carrying armed personnel in tactical gear. "They found us," Sullivan said with remarkable calm, as if he'd been expecting this moment. "Someone compromised the extraction protocol." Ryan's team moved with practiced efficiency, securing Sullivan and the evidence while coordinating with local forces for defensive positioning. As clinic staff evacuated patients to interior rooms, Ryan established communication with the approaching vessels, identifying himself as a federal agent conducting an official operation. The response came not in words, but in actions. The first, shots fired at the clinic's communications array, disabling their satellite connection to outside support. The attackers' coordination and equipment suggested military or specialized security training, their approach following tactical protocols designed to isolate and contain the target before main force arrival. "These aren't local pirates," Ryan observed grimly, positioning his team at defensive points throughout the clinic. "This is a professional retrieval operation." What followed was 40 minutes of disciplined combat. The attackers methodically attempting to breach the clinic's limited defenses, while Ryan's team and local security forces maintained a protective perimeter around Sullivan and the evidence. The attackers' focus became clear quickly. They made repeated specialized attempts to reach the administrative section where the hard drives were secured, largely bypassing areas containing only patients or medical supplies. The tide turned with the distant sound of helicopter rotors. The extraction team Ryan had positioned as secondary support, arriving ahead of schedule, having monitored the communications blackout. The attackers withdrew with the same tactical discipline that had characterized their assault, leaving behind 2 wounded men who would later be identified as former Special Operations personnel employed through a security contractor with ties to Centurion Group. As the helicopter transported them to a secure military facility, Sullivan finally revealed the source of his inside information. Colonel David Richards, who had been documenting the operation's military connections from within, while feeding Sullivan information to keep him one step ahead of those hunting him. Richards recruited me after I tried to report the first discrepancies, Sullivan explained, over the helicopter's communication system. He was already building a case, but needed someone outside the chain of command who could move freely in regions where the manufacturing was happening. My disgrace and disappearance provided perfect cover. The revelation transformed Ryan's understanding of his earlier confrontation with Richards. The colonel's apparent dismissal of the investigation had been carefully calculated, providing a crucial lead while maintaining his cover within the military hierarchy. His position close to Senator Chambers had allowed him to monitor the operation's defensive maneuvers, while appearing to be part of the system protecting it. Over the next 72 hours, coordinated raids targeted facilities in 8 countries, dismantling manufacturing operations, seizing records, and identifying compromised officials throughout military and veteran healthcare systems. The synchronized global response prevented the organization from destroying evidence or executing contingency plans, resulting in one of the largest pharmaceutical counterfeiting prosecutions in history. Senator Chambers was taken into custody. While attempting to board a private jet to a non-extradition country, his dignified public persona crumbling as federal agents led him past assembled media. His extensive political connections, once his strongest asset, rapidly dissolved as evidence of his direct involvement in an operation that had harmed thousands of veterans became public. Former allies issued statements expressing shock and dismay. Campaign donors demanded return of contributions, and veteran organizations called for the severest possible penalties. The investigation that had begun with Cooper's alert response to a single duffel bag culminated in over 100 indictments across multiple jurisdictions, targeting not just those who manufactured and distributed counterfeit medications, but the network of officials who had protected the operation through intimidation, bribery, and manipulation of government processes. During the subsequent press conference, the ATF director specifically acknowledged Special Agent Mercer and K9 Cooper as the catalysts whose persistence had unraveled a criminal enterprise that conventional investigations had repeatedly failed to penetrate. Standing before the assembled media, Ryan deflected personal recognition, instead focusing attention on the broader issues the case had exposed. This investigation revealed systemic vulnerabilities in how we care for those who have served our country, he stated, Cooper sitting attentively at his side. The exploitation of these gaps was only possible because we've allowed critical healthcare services to become profit centers rather than sacred obligations. Moving forward, we must ensure that the systems designed to support our veterans are transparent, accountable, and truly focused on their well-being. 6 months after Senator Chambers' arrest, Cooper's training regimen had expanded to include detection of specific chemical compounds used in counterfeit pharmaceuticals. The specialized program, developed in collaboration with Dr. Chen, was being implemented across federal K9 units nationwide, creating a new frontline defense against medication fraud targeting vulnerable populations. Ryan visited Marcus Wilson at the rehabilitation center, where he was recovering both from his ordeal and from properly managed withdrawal from the medications that had been used to control him. The facility, funded in part by assets seized from Centurion Group, specialized in treating veterans who had received counterfeit medications, addressing both the physical and psychological damage inflicted by the criminal enterprise. The doctors say I'll be able to go home next month, Wilson told Ryan as they walked through the center's garden, his movements steadier than when they had first met. They've finally got my actual condition stabilized with real medications, not whatever they were giving me before. The investigation had revealed that Wilson, like many veterans, had been deliberately overprescribed medications through compromised doctors, creating dependencies that made him vulnerable to exploitation. His initial contact by the organization hadn't been random, but carefully orchestrated based on his position at the airport and his increasing desperation for medications he now struggled to afford. We've identified over 8,000 veterans who received these counterfeits, Ryan explained, but the task force believes the actual number may be 3 times higher. Many don't know they were affected. Wilson nodded, his expression reflecting the weight of this knowledge. That's why I agreed to tell my story publicly. People need to know this wasn't just about money. This was about deliberately harming veterans to profit from their suffering. Wilson's testimony before a congressional committee investigating the scandal had proven particularly powerful. His straightforward account of manipulation and exploitation, putting a human face on an operation that might otherwise have been viewed as merely financial fraud, rather than a profound betrayal of those who had served. The legislation that emerged from these hearings, the Sullivan-Wilson Veterans Pharmaceutical Security Act, established new protections, including blockchain tracking of medication supply chains, independent testing protocols, and enhanced whistleblower protections specifically designed to prevent similar operations in the future. Ryan's final meeting with Colonel Richards took place not in a government office, but on the grounds of Arlington National Cemetery, where they walked in silence to the section containing the markers for those who had served in Afghanistan. Though no bodies had been recovered, memorial stones had been placed for soldiers officially listed as killed in action, including Staff Sergeant Michael Landry. "He'd be proud of what you did, Mercer," Richard said quietly as they stood before Landry's stone. "He always said you were the one who saw patterns others missed." Ryan touched the black band on his wrist, the habitual gesture now carrying different weight after an investigation that had forced him to reconsider what service and sacrifice truly meant. "How many of these are empty graves, sir? How many of these soldiers were recruited into the operation?" Richard shook his head. "We'll probably never know for certain." Sullivan identified 14 definitely alive, despite official death notifications, but given the operation's scope, there could be dozens more. Some may not even realize the full extent of what they became part of. The colonel had paid a professional price for his years of covert investigation. The revelation of his deception, even in service of justice, had ended any possibility of further advancement. Yet as they walked among the markers of the fallen, Ryan recognized in Richard's bearing not regret but resolution, the quiet certainty of a man who had chosen the harder right over the easier wrong. "What happens to them now?" Ryan asked, thinking of Reeves and the others who had been both perpetrators and victims, soldiers who had been exploited at vulnerable moments and drawn into a criminal enterprise through combination of coercion and deception. "Case-by-case evaluation," Richards replied. "Those who cooperated, like Reeves, will likely receive consideration during sentencing. Some may qualify for specialized rehabilitation programs. But there's no simple answer. They made choices, even if those choices came under extraordinary pressure." As they prepared to part ways, Richards handed Ryan a small wooden box. Inside lay a set of dog tags. Not standard issue, but specialized K9 handler identification tags bearing Cooper's name, service number, and a simple inscription: "Faithful beyond duty. You're from those of us who understand what you both accomplished," Richards explained. "Some battles choose you, not the other way around. You and Cooper answered when it mattered most." The formal ceremony honoring the task force responsible for dismantling the counterfeit drug network filled the Department of Justice's largest assembly space. Representatives from multiple agencies gathered to recognize extraordinary service in an investigation that had exposed corruption at the highest levels while potentially saving thousands of veterans from continuing harm. Ryan sat uncomfortably. In his dress uniform, Cooper lying at his feet, both still unaccustomed to public recognition, after years of working cases that often remained unheralded or unacknowledged. When the Attorney General called Ryan forward to receive the department's highest commendation, the assembled officials rose in standing ovation, not merely for the Chamber's case, but for a commitment to justice that had persevered despite institutional resistance and personal risk. Special Agent Mercer represents the finest traditions of service, the Attorney General stated, shaking Ryan's hand as photographers captured the moment. His refusal to abandon this investigation despite significant obstacles exemplifies the dedication we expect from those entrusted with upholding our laws and protecting our citizens. Cooper received his own formal recognition, a specialized service medal attached to his working harness, and an official commendation noting his exceptional detection abilities and unwavering focus that initiated a case of national significance. The K9 accepted these honors with the same disciplined attention he brought to training exercises, seemingly unimpressed by the ceremonial aspects, but responsive as always to Ryan's subtle cues. After the formal proceedings concluded, Ryan visited the newly established memorial for veterans who had died as a result of receiving counterfeit medications. What had begun as a small gathering place for affected families had evolved into an official installation, a curved wall bearing the names of those confirmed to have died from the counterfeits, with space left for additional names as ongoing. Medical reviews identified more victims. Karen Sullivan was already there, tending to fresh flowers placed beneath her husband's official portrait. Though Derek Sullivan had survived in body, the man she had married had been lost the day he was. Forced to abandon his identity, his career, and his family to pursue the truth. The Sullivan she had known ceased to exist the moment he went underground, replaced by a man driven by singular purpose. "They've offered him a new identity, witness protection," she told Ryan as they sat on a bench facing the memorial. "He's considering it, but I don't know if he can ever really come back from what he's been through. He's different now." Ryan understood this transformation intimately, how pursuit of justice could reshape a person's entire being, altering priorities and perspectives in ways that made returning to normal life nearly impossible. Sullivan had crossed boundaries and made compromises that, while necessary to his mission, had fundamentally changed him. He saved countless lives, Ryan offered, knowing this provided both comfort and little consolation for the personal loss she had experienced. "What he sacrificed made a difference," Karen nodded, a sad smile crossing her features. "That's what makes it harder in some ways. If it had all been for nothing, maybe we could be angry instead of just hollowed out. He did exactly what his conscience demanded, and it cost us everything." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the memorial, Ryan's phone vibrated with a notification, another case requiring attention, another situation where his and Cooper's specialized skills were needed. The work continued, as it always would, each investigation an opportunity to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. For Ryan Mercer and Cooper, the most fitting tribute to those harmed by the counterfeit drug operation was to continue their work with renewed purpose, more alert to the ways systems could be corrupted, more attentive to the voices of those reporting concerns, more determined to follow evidence wherever it led, regardless of the power or position of those involved. As they walked toward the waiting vehicle, Cooper's alert posture and focused gaze mirrored Ryan's own restored sense of mission. The case had changed them both, deepening their partnership, expanding their capabilities, and reinforcing the understanding that sometimes the most important service comes not in dramatic battlefield moments, but in the patient, persistent pursuit of truth in the face of systemic resistance. For Ryan, The black band bearing Landry's name remained on his wrist, not just as memorial to a fallen brother, but as reminder of the obligation that extended beyond the battlefield. The promise made to those who serve alongside us doesn't end when the uniform comes off. It continues in civilian life, in the systems designed to support veterans, and in the vigilance required to ensure those systems truly serve their intended purpose. In the months that followed, Ryan and Cooper would investigate dozens more cases, each building on lessons learned during the Chamber's investigation. Their methods evolved, their awareness deepened, and their commitment to exposing exploitation, particularly of veterans and other vulnerable populations, became the defining characteristic of their work together. The Senate hearing room fell, silent, as Ryan completed his testimony on proposed legislation to strengthen pharmaceutical security throughout government healthcare systems. His presentation had methodically outlined vulnerabilities exposed by the Chamber's investigation, documenting how bureaucratic compartmentalization and privatized oversight had created perfect conditions for exploitation. Senator Eleanor Martinez, the committee chairwoman, leaned toward her microphone. Based on your investigation, Agent Mercer, what single change would most effectively prevent similar operations in the future? Ryan considered the question carefully, aware that his answer would likely influence regulatory approaches for years to come. Cooper sat attentively beside his chair, the dog's presence a reminder of how this journey had begun, with simple, uncompromising alertness to something wrong. The most critical change isn't procedural or technological, Ryan finally responded. It's cultural. We must create systems where those who report concerns are protected rather than penalized, where pattern recognition is valued over compartmentalization, and where the well-being of patients, particularly those who have served our country, takes absolute priority over efficiency metrics or profit considerations. He gestured toward Sullivan Wilson and the families of victims seated in the gallery. Every person harmed in this case first encountered someone who noticed something wrong, but lacked either the authority or protection to effectively intervene. The technology to secure our pharmaceutical supply chain already exists. What we've lacked is the commitment to prioritize integrity over expediency and to protect those who speak up when standards are compromised. As the hearing concluded, Ryan and Cooper walked together through the Capitol corridors, their synchronized movement reflecting years of partnership. Outside, veterans and advocacy groups had gathered in support of the proposed legislation, many carrying photographs of those who had received counterfeit medications. Among the assembled advocates, Ryan recognized familiar faces. Marcus Wilson, with his family, now volunteering with a veterans support organization. Medical professionals who had worked with Sullivan to document the global operation. Family members of victims who had transformed grief into activism. A reporter approached, microphone extended. Agent Mercer, after everything you've uncovered, do you believe the system can be fixed? Ryan glanced down at Cooper, who maintained the same alert, ready posture he had displayed that day at the airport when he first detected something wrong in an ordinary piece of luggage. The dog's unwavering focus, his refusal to be distracted or deterred once he identified a threat, had initiated a case that ultimately protected thousands. I believe systems are only as good as the people within them, Ryan replied. What gives? Me hope isn't new regulations or technology, but seeing how many individuals refused to look away when they recognized injustice, regardless of personal cost. That's the foundation of any meaningful reform, the willingness of those who serve to remember why they wear the uniform, even after they take it off. As they walked among the gathered advocates, Ryan reflected on how a single alert from a dedicated K9 had expanded into a movement for accountability and reform. The path from that first moment at the airport baggage claim to this nationwide advocacy effort hadn't been direct or easy, but it had been necessary, a reminder that justice often begins not with grand gestures, but with simple, persistent attention to details that others might overlook. For Ryan Mercer and Cooper, the work would continue, one case, one alert, one investigation at a time, carrying forward the lesson that had defined their most significant case. True service means remaining vigilant not just against external threats, but against the internal corruption that can transform systems of support into mechanisms of exploitation. The journey continues, sustained by the knowledge that integrity, when maintained through the darkest challenges, becomes not just an individual virtue, but a force capable of transforming even the most compromised systems. For as long as they served together, Ryan and Cooper would embody this principle: faithful beyond duty, vigilant beyond expectation, committed beyond requirement to protecting those who had already sacrificed so much in service to others. Cooper's rehabilitation regimen progressed with remarkable speed in the months following the Senate hearings. The specialized training facility outside Atlanta had implemented innovative techniques to expand the Belgian Malinois detection capabilities beyond standard explosives to include the chemical signatures of counterfeit pharmaceuticals. Ryan visited daily, participating in training sessions and monitoring his partner's growing proficiency with a mixture of professional pride and personal relief. The case that had begun with Cooper's alert response to a single piece of luggage had expanded into a nationwide effort to secure pharmaceutical supply chains. Agencies across the federal government had implemented new protocols based directly on vulnerabilities exposed by their investigation. Most significantly, the Veterans Affairs Administration had completely restructured its pharmaceutical acquisition and security systems with multiple verification points and independent testing of medication batches. On the morning Cooper was scheduled for his final certification test, Ryan arrived at the training center to find Dr. Eliza Chen already there, clipboard in hand, methodically arranging testing stations throughout the specialized course. "Couldn't stay away?" Ryan asked, noting the dark circles under her eyes that suggested she'd been working through the night. Eliza smiled briefly, her focus remaining on the task at hand. "Someone needs to verify that these new detection parameters are scientifically sound. Besides, Cooper deserves the best possible validation of his capabilities." Over the past 6 months, Eliza had become an integral part of developing the new pharmaceutical detection protocols. Her background in both chemistry and veteran healthcare provided unique insights into how counterfeit medications might be most effectively identified. The standardized training program she had created was being implemented across federal and state agencies, creating a coordinated defense against pharmaceutical fraud. Cooper performed flawlessly during the certification, identifying minute traces of compounds associated with counterfeit production, while ignoring legitimate medications, even when both were deliberately placed in close proximity. His discrimination abilities far exceeded the established baseline, setting new standards for the program. "He's not just passing these tests," Eliza observed as she reviewed the data. "He's redefining what's possible in pharmaceutical detection. Most dogs need to be trained on specific compounds, but Cooper seems to categorize chemical families intuitively, allowing him to identify variations he hasn't specifically trained on." Ryan nodded, watching Cooper receive his reward. A few moments, with his favorite toy as recognition for a successful alert. He's always been able to see patterns that others miss. That's what started this whole investigation. As they walked back to the administrative building, Eliza handed Ryan a file containing the latest medical updates on veterans identified through the case. The long-term health monitoring program has now enrolled over 12,000 veterans who received counterfeits. Early intervention seems to be mitigating organ damage in most cases, but we're still discovering new affected populations as the investigation expands. The file included statistical analyses showing clusters of unusual medical complications. At facilities where Centurion Group had managed security, patterns that would have been dismissed as coincidental without the comprehensive data now being assembled. Each graph represented hundreds of veterans whose declining health had been attributed to service-related conditions rather than systematically administered toxins. We're implementing universal testing for all VA-dispensed medications now, Eliza continued. The new spectrographic analysis can detect irregularities in seconds, even through sealed packaging. It won't replace dogs like Cooper for field operations, but it adds another layer of protection within the facilities themselves. Ryan studied the implementation schedule, noting that priority had been given to facilities serving the most vulnerable veteran populations, those with complex medical needs who had been specifically targeted by the counterfeiting operation for their routine use of multiple medications and limited ability to advocate for themselves when symptoms worsened. "What about the whistleblower protections?" he asked, thinking of Sullivan, Wilson, and the many others who had attempted to report concerns through proper channels only to face retaliation. "Being implemented now," Eliza confirmed. "Direct reporting channels to independent oversight, anonymized, submission systems, and mandatory investigations of all pharmaceutical discrepancies regardless of scale. Most importantly, administrative separation of security operations from medication management. No single entity controls both aspects anymore." These structural reforms represented the most significant overhaul of veteran pharmaceutical services in decades, spurred by public outrage as details of the counterfeiting operation continued to emerge. Veteran service organizations had mobilized unprecedented advocacy campaigns, demanding accountability and transparent reform rather than the typical cycle of investigation followed by incremental changes. As Cooper completed his final certification exercise, Ryan received a call from Deputy Director Blackwell, recently promoted to oversee a new division focused specifically on crimes targeting veteran services. "Mercer, I need you and Cooper in Minneapolis tomorrow morning. We've identified another potential node in the Chamber's network operating through a private medical research facility. They're conducting a clinical trial that appears to be continuing the work of the counterfeiting operation under scientific cover." Within 24 hours, Ryan and Cooper were leading a multi-agency team through a sophisticated laboratory facility where veterans had been recruited for what they believed was cutting-edge treatment for service-related conditions. In reality, the operation was systematically testing new counterfeit formulations while documenting physiological responses, essentially using veterans as unwitting test subjects to refine their poisoning techniques. Cooper moved through the facility with methodical precision, alerting on hidden storage areas containing both counterfeiting equipment and production chemicals that matched those found in previous facilities. Most disturbing was a secure database containing detailed medical tracking of test subjects, documenting organ function decline with clinical detachment. "They were refining their approach," observed the forensic toxicologist examining the data. "These records show systematic adjustments to chemical compositions based on how quickly adverse effects manifested. They were calibrating for maximum profit, balancing toxicity against detection probability." The operation in Minneapolis revealed connections to 3 additional research facilities across the Midwest, each operating under different corporate entities but following identical protocols and sharing data through encrypted channels. The expanded investigation suggested that despite Chambers' arrest and the dismantling of Centurion Group, elements of the operation had simply adapted and continued under new organizational structures. They started with special operations units deployed to remote locations, Morrison explained, displaying medical records showing unusual patterns of organ damage in elite forces. Isolated teams, minimal oversight, performance demands that masked early symptoms, perfect testing conditions. As the program expanded, it evolved from military performance enhancement to broader pharmaceutical manipulation, eventually targeting veteran populations through the VA system as the most accessible and comprehensive testing ground available. The operation that Ryan and Cooper had exposed represented just the commercial exploitation phase of a program with much deeper origins in classified military research. Morrison's evidence included internal communications showing how program directors had systematically silenced concerns, eliminated oversight, and eventually transitioned what began as a government research initiative into a private criminal enterprise that maintained connections to its classified origins through carefully placed officials. Chambers wasn't the top, Morrison confirmed. He was a convenient interface between the original program and its commercial applications, politically protected enough to operate with minimal scrutiny, but ultimately expendable if exposed. The documentation identified 3 senior officials: former Defense Department research director, now heading a private contractor, a senior FDA administrator responsible for pharmaceutical emergency approvals, and a special operations commander who had facilitated early field testing as the core leadership group that had protected the program through its evolution from classified research to criminal enterprise. They called themselves the Commissary. Morrison explained, using the military term for the base store where service members purchase supplies. They saw themselves as providing necessary services outside restrictive regulations, improving soldier performance, testing medical approaches without bureaucratic limitations, eventually generating funding for classified operations through pharmaceutical sales. This revelation explained the operation's exceptional resilience and adaptation capabilities. It had been designed from its inception by military and intelligence professionals accustomed to compartmentalized operations, contingency planning, and deep cover activities. The counterfeiting network functioned essentially as a privatized covert operation, using techniques developed for classified government activities. Sullivan found me through his network of medical whistleblowers. Morrison continued, "We've been connecting the dots between the original military program and the veteran-targeted operations you exposed. The evidence is now comprehensive enough to reach the original leadership." The extraction team secured Morrison and his documentation, implementing protocols developed specifically for high-value whistleblowers after Sullivan's experience. Within 48 hours, Morrison was providing secured testimony to a classified Congressional Oversight Committee, accompanied by a comprehensive digital archive documenting 15 years of increasingly criminal pharmaceutical experimentation. The revelations triggered specialized investigations into classified programs across multiple agencies, focusing particularly on medical testing and pharmaceutical deployment protocols. Security was enhanced around additional known whistleblowers as the extent of the operation's reach became clear. The same techniques used to silence Morrison and Sullivan had likely been employed against others who had encountered evidence of the program. These investigations yielded results faster than expected. Within weeks, one of the 3 identified leaders, the FDA administrator, approached federal prosecutors seeking cooperation terms. Her testimony confirmed Morrison's account, while adding crucial details about how the operation had maintained protection through strategic placement of compromised officials throughout regulatory and oversight bodies. They created an entire shadow regulatory system, Ryan explained during a briefing to an expanded task force. Every legitimate safeguard had a corresponding compromised element designed to circumvent it. Inspection schedules were leaked, testing protocols manipulated, documentation altered, all through officials who had been recruited, compromised, or coerced. The operations techniques for compromising officials mirrored those used against veterans like Wilson, identifying personal vulnerabilities, offering solutions to pressing problems, incrementally involving targets in increasingly questionable activities until they were too compromised to resist further demands. This systematic approach had created a network of facilitators who enabled the operation while maintaining plausible deniability about its full scope. As arrests expanded to include officials across multiple agencies, public attention focused increasingly on the systemic failures that had allowed such widespread exploitation to continue for years, despite numerous attempted warnings. Congressional hearings generated unprecedented bipartisan support for comprehensive reform of both military and veteran healthcare systems, with emphasis on independent oversight, whistleblower protections, and transparent accountability structures. Cooper's role in initiating the investigation became emblematic of the importance of independent verification systems. His uncompromising alert response at the airport had initiated a case that conventional oversight had repeatedly failed to address. The specialized K9 pharmaceutical detection program expanded rapidly, becoming a cornerstone of the reformed security approach to veteran and military health care. 8 months after Morrison's extraction, Ryan and Cooper attended the dedication ceremony for the new Veterans Pharmaceutical Security Center, a specialized facility combining advanced testing technology, K9 detection teams, and dedicated oversight personnel focused exclusively on ensuring medication safety across all veteran healthcare systems. The center's main conference room had been named in honor of Derek Sullivan, recognizing his pivotal role in documenting the global reach of the counterfeiting operation. Though Sullivan remained in a modified witness protection program, his work had transformed pharmaceutical security protocols worldwide, with military and veteran systems in multiple countries implementing standards based on his findings. As Ryan moved through the facility with Cooper at his side, he noted how each security component directly addressed vulnerabilities exposed during their investigation. From specialized chemical detection equipment to secure blockchain tracking of all pharmaceutical shipments to independent testing of random samples from every medication batch. Most significantly, the center included a dedicated whistleblower reception unit staffed by professionals trained specifically to evaluate and protect those reporting concerns about medication safety or administration. The unit operated independently from both VA administration and security structures, reporting directly to a civilian oversight board composed primarily of veterans and healthcare specialists. Dr. Chen, now serving as the center's scientific director, led Ryan through the Advanced Detection Laboratory, where both technical and K9 teams trained continually on emerging pharmaceutical threats. "We're not just defending against known counterfeiting techniques," she explained. "We're anticipating future adaptations based on chemical fingerprinting and predictive modeling." The facility represented not merely a response to the specific counterfeit operation they had exposed, but a fundamental reconceptualization of how veteran healthcare security should function: proactive rather than reactive, independent rather than integrated into the systems it monitored, and deliberately redundant to prevent any single point of compromise from endangering the entire structure. As they completed the tour, Ryan received notification that the final member of the commissary, the Special Operations Commander who had facilitated early testing, had been taken into custody while attempting to cross into Canada with falsified identification. With his arrest, all major leadership elements of the original operation had been identified and apprehended, though investigations into affiliated networks continued worldwide. Later that evening, Ryan and Cooper visited Marcus Wilson at his home, where he had established a local veteran support group focused specifically on helping those affected by the counterfeit medication scheme. Wilson's recovery had progressed remarkably, not just physical healing from the effects of the counterfeits he had unknowingly received, but psychological restoration as he transformed his traumatic experience into advocacy for others similarly harmed. The medical monitoring program identified 37 veterans just in this county who received counterfeits, Wilson explained as they sat on his porch, Cooper relaxing at Ryan's feet. We're making sure they all get proper treatment and support through the restoration program. The comprehensive victim support initiative established in the wake of the investigation provided not only medical treatment for those physically harmed by counterfeits, but also financial compensation, psychological services, and dedicated case management to navigate the complex recovery process. Most importantly, it acknowledged the systematic betrayal these veterans had experienced and validated. The reality of symptoms many had been told were imaginary or psychosomatic. That's what matters most to a lot of these guys, Wilson continued. Just having someone officially recognize that what happened to them was real, that they weren't losing their minds when their symptoms didn't match what doctors expected, that the system meant to care for them was actually harming them. This validation extended beyond individual veterans to affirm the experiences of medical personnel who had attempted to report concerns, nurses who noticed unusual symptom patterns, pharmacists who questioned medication appearances, physicians who observed unexpected treatment failures. Many had been dismissed as alarmist or incompetent when they raised issues that contradicted established explanations. Sullivan called me last week, Wilson mentioned as the visit concluded. He's still in the program, but he's working remotely with the international implementation team, helping other countries establish similar security systems. Said to tell you they just identified and shut down another production facility in Eastern Europe, using the protocols Cooper helped establish. The global impact of their investigation continued to expand as additional countries implemented security measures modeled on those developed through the case. What had begun as a single alert from a detection dog had evolved into an international standard for pharmaceutical security, particularly for medications destined for military and veteran populations. As Ryan drove home that evening, Cooper, resting comfortably in the specially designed rear compartment of his vehicle, he reflected on how their partnership had fundamentally changed not just individual lives, but entire systems designed to protect those who had served. The Belgian Malinois had demonstrated how a single moment of unwavering alertness, refusing to ignore something wrong despite protocols or pressures, could ultimately transform institutions that had failed in their essential purposes. 2 weeks later, Ryan testified before an international conference on pharmaceutical security, describing how standard detection protocols had failed to identify the counterfeit operation until Cooper's alert behavior initiated a comprehensive investigation. His presentation emphasized not just technical detection capabilities, but the importance of system designs that encouraged and protected those who noticed discrepancies rather than isolating or penalizing them. The most sophisticated technology and protocols are only as effective as the people implementing them, Ryan explained to representatives from dozens of countries. What ultimately exposed this operation wasn't advanced analytics or regulatory oversight. but individuals at various levels who refused to ignore what they were seeing despite institutional pressure to maintain established explanations. Following his presentation, Ryan was approached by military and security representatives from several nations, each describing similar patterns they had begun investigating in their own healthcare systems, following protocols established through the Chambers case. The operational techniques documented through their investigation had proven remarkably consistent across national boundaries, suggesting either coordinated implementation or a common origin point for the methodology. We've identified nearly identical approaches in our military supply chains, confirmed a British pharmaceutical security director. The same compartmentalization, the same targeting of oversight personnel, even similar chemical substitutions. In the counterfeits themselves, it's as if they were working from the same playbook. This international dimension reinforced Morrison's account of the operation's origins in classified research, suggesting that similar programs may have been implemented across Allied military structures, perhaps beginning as legitimate cooperative research before evolving into exploitative criminal enterprises through similar paths. As these international connections became clearer, Ryan and Cooper were increasingly called upon to assist with identification and training efforts worldwide. Their experience with the original case provided invaluable context for investigations unfolding in other countries, each revealing additional elements of what now appeared to be a transnational criminal network with roots in military pharmaceutical development. 1 year after the Senate hearings, Cooper received specialized recognition from an international coalition of veteran service organizations, a custom-designed working harness bearing emblems from military and veteran organizations across multiple countries, acknowledging his role in initiating protections that now extended to service members worldwide. The ceremony took place at the National K9 Veteran Memorial, where Cooper's alert behavior at the airport was now included in training materials as a case study in detection dog persistence and handler trust. The Belgian Malinois remained characteristically focused throughout the ceremony, his attention continuously returning to Ryan rather than the assembled dignitaries or the honors being bestowed. This unwavering focus, the quality that had allowed him to detect anomalies others missed and persist despite institutional skepticism, remained Cooper's defining characteristic. While the systems and protocols developed through their case had become increasingly sophisticated, the foundation remained the simple, uncompromising alertness Cooper had demonstrated that day in the airport when he refused to move past a single suspicious bag. For Ryan Mercer, the transformation extended beyond professional achievement to personal healing. The black band bearing Landry's name remained on his wrist, but it now represented connection rather than loss. A reminder that service continues beyond deployment, that obligations to fellow veterans endure long after uniforms are set aside, and that justice sometimes arrives through unexpected channels. The investigation had changed him in ways he was still discovering, opening him to collaborative approaches he might previously have resisted, helping him recognize patterns of institutional failure where he once saw only individual wrongdoing, and most significantly, restoring faith in the possibility of meaningful reform even within deeply compromised systems. As Ryan and Cooper continued their work together, training new handler teams and consulting on emerging pharmaceutical security threats, they carried forward the essential lesson their case had revealed: that integrity, maintained with unwavering commitment despite institutional pressure, remains the foundation of all meaningful security and the ultimate protection for those who have served. 2 years after Cooper's initial alert at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, the specialized pharmaceutical security program had expanded to include over 40 K9 teams deployed across military installations, VA facilities, and major transportation hubs nationwide. Each team had been trained using protocols developed through Ryan and Cooper's case experiences, focusing not just on specific chemical detection, but on the systematic integrity of pharmaceutical supply chains. On a crisp autumn morning, Ryan stood observing the newest class of handler dog teams, completing their certification exercises at the National K9 Training Center. Cooper sat attentively at his side, now serving primarily as a demonstration dog for the program rather than actively working cases, a concession to his advancing age and the specialized nature of his experience. He still notices things before the younger dogs, remarked Training Director Sarah Michaels as they watched a black Labrador working through a complex detection scenario. That intuitive leap he makes between similar chemical structures, we still can't fully train that. It's something innate to him. Dr. Thomas Reeves, the facility's chief pharmaceutical analyst, greeted them at the secure entrance. "We've isolated samples from 3 different medication types," he explained as they moved through decontamination protocols, all containing correct active pharmaceutical ingredients, but with modified delivery mechanisms that create essentially randomized dosing patterns. The laboratory's main testing area contains sophisticated analytical equipment surrounding central workstations, where technicians conducted both instrumental and manual examinations of suspect medications. In a specially designed section, several K9 teams were already working with samples, attempting to establish detection parameters for the new counterfeits. "The challenge is fundamental," Reeves continued, leading them to a secure testing room. "These aren't technically counterfeit in the traditional sense. Chemically, they contain what the label claims. The manipulation is structural rather than compositional, affecting how the medications behave in the body rather than what they contain." Cooper's testing session began with standard protocol: exposure to verified legitimate samples to establish baseline recognition, followed by introduction of the modified counterfeits in progressively challenging scenarios. Initially, the dog showed minimal alert response, confirming the sophisticated nature of the counterfeits. They lacked the obvious chemical markers that typically triggered detection. "Try the dissolution testing samples," suggested Eliza, who had arrived during the initial session. "The structural differences might be more detectable once the binding agents begin breaking down." This approach yielded immediate results. When presented with samples that had been subjected to simulated digestive processes, Cooper's alert behavior became pronounced and consistent. Something in the breakdown products of the modified binding agents triggered his detection response, even though the intact medications had not. "That's our window," Ryan observed, watching Cooper precisely indicate each dissolved counterfeit sample while ignoring legitimate medications subjected to identical processes. "They've masked the initial chemical signatures, but the modifications become detectable once dissolution begins." This discovery provided the foundation for developing new detection protocols, focusing not just on the medications in their original form, but on their behavior during simulated digestive processes. Within hours, the laboratory team had identified specific chemical markers released during dissolution that could be targeted for both instrumental and canine detection. "We need to update all the screening protocols," Eliza noted, reviewing preliminary data. "Every checkpoint in the supply chain needs revised testing parameters focusing on dissolution behavior rather than just composition analysis." The rapid identification and response to this new counterfeiting approach directly reflected lessons learned from the original case. particularly the importance of adaptive, multi-layered security approaches that anticipated criminal evolution rather than simply reacting to known threats. Where the initial counterfeiting operation had exploited systematic gaps in oversight for years before detection, this new variant had been identified and characterized within weeks of initial deployment. As the laboratory team worked to implement updated detection protocols, Ryan received notification of another significant development. Derek Sullivan had requested secure communication through channels established specifically for his ongoing security consulting work. The message was brief but consequential. Original research located, need specialized retrieval team. Sullivan's work tracking the historical origins of the pharmaceutical exploitation program had continued despite his semi-protected status, focusing particularly on documenting connections between classified military research and subsequent criminal applications. His message suggested he had located documentation of the original performance enhancement program that Morrison had identified as the precursor to the counterfeiting operation, potentially the founding research that had established methodologies later adapted for criminal purposes. Within 48 hours, Ryan had assembled a specialized team, including forensic document experts, pharmaceutical analysts, and security specialists with appropriate clearances to handle potentially classified materials. Cooper accompanied the team despite his reduced field schedule, his established detection capabilities providing essential verification against potential contamination or degraded chemical compounds. The recovery location was a long-abandoned research facility in the Nevada desert, originally established as an auxiliary site for a military testing range, but officially decommissioned and cleared decades earlier. Sullivan's intelligence suggested that documentation from the original program had been secured in underground storage areas when the program transitioned from official oversight to private operation, preserved by program principals as insurance against potential betrayal by their associates. The facility's surface structures had been systematically stripped and partially demolished during decommissioning, leaving little evidence of its former purpose. Ground-penetrating radar identified extensive subsurface construction incongruous with the facility's official blueprints, sealed chambers and passageways that didn't appear in any public documentation. Access required specialized equipment and careful structural reinforcement of deteriorated entry points. As the team established secure access to the underground sections, Cooper's behavior changed noticeably, his typically confident demeanor becoming hesitant, ears flattening periodically. As they moved deeper into the facility, "He's sensing something," Ryan observed, recognizing patterns from previous cases involving contaminated environments. Possibly residual chemical exposure. Environmental specialists conducted immediate atmospheric testing, confirming low-level presence of several compounds associated with pharmaceutical manufacturing and testing. Though concentrations were well below hazardous thresholds for brief exposure, the team implemented enhanced protective protocols, including specialized respiratory equipment and contact barriers. The facility's main underground section contained what appeared to be a comprehensive research archive. Sealed storage units, organized chronologically, containing documentation spanning nearly 2 decades of pharmaceutical development. Initial examination confirmed Sullivan's intelligence. This was indeed the original documentation from the classified performance enhancement program that had eventually evolved into the counterfeiting operation. Most significantly, the archive contained complete research protocols, testing data, and subject monitoring records from the program's earliest phases, documentation that had been systematically purged from official military and medical records when the program transitioned to unofficial status. These materials provided unprecedented insight into how legitimate military research had transformed into criminal enterprise through gradual ethical compromise and deliberate exploitation of oversight gaps. They documented everything, noted the forensic analyst examining the earliest files, complete research protocols, test subject data, adverse event reports, even internal discussions about ethical concerns that were overridden. They preserved the entire evolution of the program. This comprehensive documentation established definitive evidence not just of criminal pharmaceutical activities, but of the systematic corruption of legitimate research processes and deliberate endangerment of military personnel through unauthorized testing. The records detailed how initial performance enhancement research had identified concerning side effects that program leaders had deliberately obscured to maintain funding and operational authority. Most disturbing were detailed protocols for selecting test subjects, specifically targeting deployed units with limited communication capabilities, service members with minimal family connections, and individuals unlikely to have sophisticated medical advocacy if problems developed. The program had deliberately exploited the most vulnerable within military populations, establishing methodologies later applied to veteran communities through the counterfeiting operation. The archive also contained comprehensive documentation of transitional phases between legitimate research and criminal enterprise, including financial records detailing how program resources were gradually shifted from official budgets to private funding sources, allowing research to continue after formal authorization ended. These records provided direct evidence linking military officials to subsequent commercial exploitation through a carefully constructed network of shell companies and consulting arrangements. As the forensic team secured and catalogued the archive, contents Cooper alerted to a sealed storage unit in a secondary chamber, exhibiting the distinctive behavior pattern associated with his pharmaceutical detection training. When the unit was carefully opened, it revealed not documentation, but preserved samples, a comprehensive collection of compounds developed throughout the program's evolution. From initial performance enhancement formulations to early counterfeits, testing various delivery methods. This physical evidence provided something the investigation had previously lacked, a complete developmental history of the compounds that had eventually been deployed as counterfeits throughout veteran healthcare systems. Chemical analysis established direct lineage between early military research formulations and the counterfeits Cooper had initially detected at the airport, confirming the operational continuity Morrison had described. The recovery operation continued for 9 days, yielding over 200,000 pages of documentation and several hundred preserved samples representing the complete evolution of the program from classified research to criminal enterprise. This evidence established an unbroken chain of activity spanning more than 15 years, documenting how techniques and methodologies developed for military purposes had been systematically repurposed for exploitation of veteran populations. Most significantly, the archive contained internal security protocols detailing how the program had maintained protection throughout its evolution, identifying compromised officials, outlining blackmail leverage, and documenting systematic obstruction of oversight mechanisms. These materials provided a comprehensive map of corrupt influence that extended far beyond the individuals already identified and prosecuted. As the evidence was transported to secure facilities for comprehensive analysis, Ryan received communication from Sullivan requesting in-person debriefing at a designated secure location. Despite security concerns, the request was approved, given Sullivan's critical role in locating the archive and his unparalleled understanding of the program's historical evolution. The meeting took place at a secure government facility under protocols, established specifically for high-value intelligence sources. Sullivan appeared markedly changed from the medic Ryan had first encountered in the Philippines, thinner, more weathered, with the hypervigilant demeanor of someone who had spent years in hostile territory. Yet his analytical precision remained, evident as he methodically outlined connections between the recovered documentation and ongoing international pharmaceutical security concerns. "The archive confirms what we suspected," Sullivan explained, reviewing preliminary analysis results. "This wasn't an isolated criminal operation. It was the commercialization of classified research that never should have left government oversight. They perfected these techniques on our own troops, then deployed them against veterans when military security became too difficult to circumvent." Sullivan had spent the past year documenting similar patterns across multiple countries, finding evidence that parallel research programs had followed nearly identical evolutionary paths, from classified military applications to criminal exploitation of veteran populations. The methodological similarities suggested either coordinated development or common origin in shared research, potentially through classified international cooperation agreements. "We're seeing the same progression in at least 7 countries. Sullivan continued, displaying comparative analysis of counterfeiting techniques identified worldwide. Initial performance enhancement research, adverse effects concealment, transition to unofficial status, exploitation of oversight gaps, ultimately targeting veteran populations through compromised healthcare systems. This international dimension explained the sophisticated adaptation capabilities that had characterized the counterfeiting operation from the beginning. It represented not isolated criminal innovation, but the application of advanced pharmaceutical research methodologies developed through years of classified military funding and expertise. The enterprise had essentially privatized classified research capabilities, deploying them for profit through criminal networks. "The most critical finding is the selection methodology," Sullivan emphasized, highlighting documentation of how the program had identified targets for exploitation. They developed comprehensive protocols for identifying vulnerable populations, analyzing prescription patterns, benefit structures, oversight mechanisms, and advocacy resources to target those least able to recognize or resist exploitation. This targeting approach explained the operation's disproportionate impact on certain veteran populations, particularly those with complex medical needs, limited support systems, or reduced capacity for self-advocacy. The counterfeiters hadn't simply sought profit through random exploitation, but had systematically targeted those most vulnerable based on sophisticated analysis of population characteristics and system vulnerabilities. The debriefing extended over 3 days, establishing comprehensive understanding of how the recovered documentation connected to ongoing security concerns worldwide. Sullivan's unparalleled familiarity with both military pharmaceutical development and the counterfeiting operation provided crucial context for interpreting the archive's contents and identifying continuing threats based on methodologies documented in the historical records. As the debriefing concluded, Sullivan shared one final insight that would fundamentally reshape pharmaceutical security approaches moving forward. The archive confirms they were developing biological markers, genetically targeted compounds designed to affect specific population groups differently based on genetic profiles. The technology was still experimental, but the research direction is clear. This revelation that counterfeiters had been exploring genetic targeting as next-generation methodology introduced entirely new security considerations that transcended conventional pharmaceutical verification approaches. Future counterfeit operations might potentially deploy medications that appeared identical to legitimate versions in all conventional testing, but affected patients differently based on genetic characteristics, creating personalized harm nearly impossible to detect. Through standard protocols, this final insight from the archive catalyzed development of entirely new security approaches, expanding beyond chemical and structural analysis to include genetic interaction testing and population-specific monitoring protocols. The pharmaceutical security infrastructure established through the original investigation continued to evolve, incorporating each new understanding of how exploitation methodologies developed and adapted over time. For Ryan Mercer, the archive recovery represented culmination of an investigative journey that had begun with a single alert from his K9 partner at an airport baggage claim. What had initially appeared to be an isolated criminal operation had revealed itself as something far more significant: the systematic exploitation of those who had served, enabled by corruption of the very systems designed to protect them. As Cooper entered his final years of service, transitioning primarily to training demonstration and protocol development rather than active field operations, his legacy extended far beyond conventional K9 detection work. His unwavering alert that day at the airport had initiated a fundamental transformation in how military and veteran healthcare systems approached pharmaceutical security, establishing new standards of integrity, oversight, and protection that now safeguarded millions worldwide. The bond between handler and dog, the implicit trust that had led Ryan to pursue Cooper's alert despite institutional skepticism, had ultimately revealed something profound about security itself: that systems are only as strong as the relationships they comprise, that protocols are only as effective as the individuals implementing them, and that protection ultimately depends on those willing to recognize and respond to warning signs others might ignore. For veterans like Marcus Wilson, whose lives had been directly impacted by the counterfeiting operation, the comprehensive reforms emerging from the investigation represented long overdue recognition of their experiences. The systems now incorporated veteran voices directly in oversight and governance, ensuring that those who had been harmed were centrally involved in preventing similar exploitation of others who had served. As Ryan and Cooper left Sullivan's debriefing, heading toward their next assignment developing protocols for the newly identified biological counterfeit threat, they carried forward the essential understanding that had defined their most significant case: that security is not primarily technological, but human, dependent not on perfect systems, but on individuals willing to trust their training, follow their instincts, and persist when institutional momentum favors simpler explanations over uncomfortable truths. The journey that began with a dog's alert to a suspicious bag continued through the dedicated work of thousands across multiple countries, each contributing to protection systems that would continue evolving as those who would exploit veterans developed new approaches. But the foundation remained the simple, unwavering alertness Cooper had demonstrated that day at the airport, the recognition that something was wrong, and the persistence to ensure that recognition was not ignored. The memorial wall at the newly established K9 Veterans Training Center displayed photographs of the dogs whose work had fundamentally changed national security protocols. Cooper's image held the central position, his alert eyes seeming to follow visitors as they moved through the facility. Beneath his photograph, a simple inscription read, "Sometimes it takes unwavering loyalty to reveal the truth." 5 years after Cooper's initial alert at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, Ryan stood before a graduating class of new pharmaceutical detection teams, Cooper resting comfortably beside him, wearing his specialized retirement harness. Adorned with commendations from agencies worldwide. "Security isn't about perfect systems," Ryan told the handlers and their attentive partners. "It's about unwavering vigilance when something doesn't feel right. One alert, trusted and pursued, can protect thousands." The ceremony concluded with Cooper demonstrating once more the alert behavior that had launched an investigation spanning continents and transforming how nations protected their veterans. Though slowed by age, his focus remained absolute, his detection abilities still unmatched by younger dogs. As Ryan and Cooper walked among the new teams, he reflected on how a single moment of persistence had rippled outward, saving countless lives and restoring faith in systems many had given up on. The Belgian Malinois had not just detected a counterfeit, he had revealed how vigilance, maintained against institutional resistance, could transform broken systems into genuine protection. In Cooper's journey, Ryan told the assembled teams, we find the essence of true service, the courage to recognize wrong and the persistence to make it right. If you found Cooper's story as inspiring as we do, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of loyalty, courage, and unwavering dedication. Leave a comment sharing what touched you most about this remarkable K9 and his handler who refused to look away when others wouldn't see. Join us next week for another extraordinary story that reminds us how the smallest acts of vigilance can change the world.